Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Inside Update, a show brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org, where we create investigative journalism to root out corruption in Connecticut. My name is Connor Dragotis. I'm the managing editor here, and today I'm joined by Brandon Whiting, investigative reporter extraordinaire and the author of the latest investigation that you can find on the homepage of our website. It's called Family Feud, examining a contested DDS guardianship case. And Brandon, right in line with what you typically do, it's emotional, it's human, it gets into some really interesting nuance. Thanks for taking some time to talk about it, first and foremost. How you doing today?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on. I'm always glad to talk about stories.
Absolutely. I feel like I wish that this episode and basically all of our shows could be about 4.5 minutes long, where the real bulk of it is just me repeatedly telling people to go read the article. Because I feel like that's of course the best way to get all of the information here. But this one was particularly interesting because of the struggles writing it, the emotionally charged nature, which I know you do not shy away from in the slightest. But let's talk about, I guess, how this came to be, the 30,000 foot level of this investigation, again, published March 30th.
Absolutely. So this story began before John, when we had received a tip from another provider who was in the same program that John was, which is CCH. And essentially, he reached out to us and told us, hey, like the state has not been giving me my funding. So we did a story on him, and I was speaking with him, and I was like, is there anybody else you know that has had problems? And he gave me a laundry list of names, and John happened to be one of them. And I thought that his story was, really compelling, which hopefully if you go and read, you will too. But essentially, John, he looked after a developmentally disabled man for close to 20 years. And he was pretty much the primary caretaker and provider and kind of viewed him as a son of sorts. But for a list of reasons, which is better disclosed in the story, he kind of had a bad relationship with the family, the biological family of this individual, and he started to have a bad relationship with the state as well. He had various complaints that other people who have worked in the same program they could also speak to as well. And ultimately, the disabled individual was removed from his care, and there was a legal battle over it. And it's just a lot of emotions, a lot of kind of a legal gray area as far as, unless of course you are, I suppose a family law lawyer. But that was what was kind of interesting to me is, there is a strong human element to the story. And then there's also just it's tough, I can't imagine a court case like that where it's hard to get an objective truth out of it because it stems around a person who, legally can't really speak for themselves. And so it's just he said, she said. We got the he said from John. Unfortunately, we had some difficulty and reluctance getting much out of the family themselves. But I think their side was pretty well represented just via the court filings that John had given us. But yeah,
It was interesting to me, and I think you did a good job writing this in because, of course, yeah, when you end up with only one party in a story who is, really willing and able to put all the information out there from the way they see it, you're kind of left with the difficult journalistic task of trying to make sure that you're basically not just acting as an advocate, right?
yeah,
And I found even in that very first section, when I read the draft, that was from an editor's perspective. Like I am constantly trying to figure out, like, how, oh man, I know what he's writing about, but that first draft, I get excited, I get nervous because I don't know whether or not we're going to have to, go back to the drawing board on something. And you did such a wonderful job of bringing out both John's clear emotional connection to this individual who he took care of. And then in the same section, it says, Tim's father and stepmother believe John is, quote, a deeply sick and deceptive man. Do not believe a word that he says. Like you really did appropriately set it up to say, yes, this is what we're going to put forward. This is the information we have. But as we do with all of our pieces, have the skepticism to understand that, this is many shades of gray. And, we encourage our readers to be skeptical and hopefully have some critical thinking skills as you go through that. The bureaucratic element of this was also really interesting. So, I guess, could you just kind of share what is DDS actually tasked with doing? So, we have the caretaker, we have the individual who's being cared for, we have the family of that individual, but we also have this third party, which is a bureaucratic organization, a state agency with thousands of employees. What is their role in, is it accountability or just administration? What does this actually look like for them being involved in this?
So DDS, I mean, ostensibly it is to provide care for developmentally disabled individuals. As far as the CCH program goes, that John is a part of, well, was a part of, that Jared was a part of, it's really connecting, from my understanding anyways, from speaking with the providers. One thing I have noted as well is speaking with people who are very keyed into the social work field. They'll just be throwing out acronyms and verbiage left and right, and I have to stop them and be like, can you please explain what this means? Because I'm completely uninitiated. But essentially, these CCH providers, their goal is to take developmentally disabled people who are kind of borderline cases in terms of, how developed they are cognitively to kind of live on their own. So it's people who perhaps are, cognitively aware enough and developed enough to not have to live in like an intensive care home, like 24/7 type unit, but aren't quite there enough to, live on their own and clean up the house and cook food and that sort of thing. And it's supposed to be providing a home-like environment. So where DDS comes in is, I mean, as John would put it, they turn over every stone, they shake every couch cushion to see every penny that you may or may not be hiding. They're checking in with you to make sure you're bringing them to all of his doctor's appointments and that you have all of these behavior plans up to date and that you're sending over test results. And so they're really just kind of the administrators of everything as well as the fund providers. So these individuals will get residential funding, which is supposed to pay for their housing. The providers will get kind of emergency funding for, if there's a medical emergency and just any unaccounted for emergency in the month, that's supposed to go towards that. I know John and some of the other providers I spoke to would say that it's not quite enough to cover some emergencies. So it's really just they're supposed to offer kind of a support system and oversight for these providers to make sure that they're doing their jobs right and, not neglecting, not abusing people, not taking advantage of them, as well as supporting the providers in giving these individuals the care that they need.
Thank you for that. I know I don't think we should get into the details, right? Limited amount of time. Go read the investigation, right? There's my 4.5 minute pitch again. But there were allegations of double dipping, of mistreatment. There are allegations of, he said, she said is definitely the right phrase in 6 different ways across this investigation. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the access to information. My understanding is that verifying things with a government agency via FOIA or otherwise who do not want to talk or say they are unable to gets really tough, right? I mean, what roadblocks did you run into, and how do you tackle that when you're trying to put out high quality investigative journalism?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you're working on a story involving a state agency, you kind of know what route things are going to go a lot of the time. John had levied accusations against 2 individual employees themselves. Of course, I reach out to them, their work emails. That gets rerouted through the communications person. Communications person gives you your very, PR canned response, which is like two sentences that you could probably insert into the story. So on that level, it's unfortunate, but it's to be expected. Um, on the other level, what I haven't really, I guess, fully captured in this story, but hope to fully capture in future stories, is that when speaking with John, he referred me to a bunch of other people who are also CCH providers, either currently or former. The current ones, for obvious reasons, we either couldn't get a hold of them or they just didn't want to touch this thing with a 10-foot barge pole because nobody wants to have things go the wrong way. But it kind of working through the story and working and trying to speak with other providers and ex-providers, it did kind of give me the whole where there's smoke, there's fire experience. I know John's story is very, very contentious in a lot of ways. And, it's up to probate court judges to make these decisions. And as millions of other stories, including several others on our website, would show you, they really don't even get these things right a lot of the time. So that being said, a lot of the complaints that John had on the DDS side of things regarding, can I get support for when the person under my care is sick and I have to call out of work? I'm not receiving any extra payment for that. I'm losing time at my job for that. It makes it hard to hold a job. The money I'm getting reimbursed from the state as it is that enough? All of those concerns are not unique to John's story. And that is what kind of inspired me to try to put in a Freedom of Information request with DDS and just looking for the investigation files because John, they did open an investigation into him. They substantiated him for neglect and financial abuse, I believe, for the exact verbiage. But as other people would tell me who have worked for CCH, that's not unique in that when you have trouble with your bosses, next thing you know, you're found guilty of neglect and abuse. So I tried FOIAing for John's files. I tried FOIAing for some of the other CCH providers I've spoken with who have had similar experiences, investigation files. And sure enough, the law does not stipulate that none of that is public records, essentially. So these providers don't know who reported them, which on the onset, I think that's fair. If someone's I think there's validity to keeping a source anonymous. But when you're getting investigated for charges of, abuse and neglect or financial abuse, and you really can't represent yourself and you have no access to the process looking into you, and all you get is an email saying, hey, we're looking into you, and hey, you're guilty or you're not, that's kind of, yeah, that's a big transparency issue, I would say. That it kind of just jumped out to me as unexpected.
There, especially because even talking to someone like John, your opening paragraphs talk about this, but he seems to genuinely care. That's not a judgment call or on whether or not the various claims are true or not. But there's a human element here that I think is very hard to square from an idea of justice. Especially if no one else is able to get in there. It's kind of a who watches the watchers type argument, right? Like we don't have the ability to get in there. And, yeah, to a certain extent, we're third party. Like I get that we wouldn't necessarily be given the opportunity to just review everyone's files and their personal information. But at the same time, not having the ability to review your own files or know what you are accused of. I mean, I don't know. It's April 3rd that we're recording this on, and due process is like one of those words that's flying all around the country right now. But, if you're accused of something, there's a process question there that needs to be addressed, partially because this occurs in many different departments as well, right? I mean, we see this, you and Catherine just did that investigation about higher education. We've written about higher education and the kangaroo court system there several times, but also in foster families is another one. Folks who have lost their licenses or claim that they've been retaliated against, and they're kind of just up against this black box. There's nowhere for them to go to make an appeal, at least to my knowledge, not without very significant legal costs. Going up against the state doesn't sound like an attractive financial path, especially if your complaint is, hey, I haven't been paid all that much to provide the services that I'm providing.
And it's funny you say that too, because I mean, if the fact that so many of these people I've spoken with are actively, well, actually, I don't want to go down that road. I don't want to blow anybody's spot up, but you could tell that these people do care quite a bit. It is an interesting issue on its face, just kind of looking at, you understand why these agencies, why the level of bureaucracy is so dense and why the regulations are so strict, because you're dealing with very vulnerable populations. And, we hear a million horror stories out of DCF. There are genuinely bad people. And if they see that there is a social service that will provide them with state money to do a certain job with people who, like, whether they're children, whether they're the elderly, whether they're disabled, are not very much, they're diminished in their ability to speak up for themselves. There's always going to be terrible people who take advantage of that and take the money and run with it and provide no care or actively abuse people. So you understand why there is so much regulation and restrictions, and all of these people are looked at with a fine-tooth comb. Totally get that. But then on the other hand, there is also the element of, like you said, it's clear with the people that I've spoken with, they've all cared a lot. They have been willing to fight these battles in court. They've been willing to put themselves under financial duress. And they, right or wrong from a bureaucratic standpoint, whether or not they crossed all their T's, dotted all their I's correctly, it can be hard to look at from a human level and see, okay, these are services that very few, it takes a special kind of person to want to provide these services. There's always a shortage of these service providers. So it's kind of tough to square away the regulatory necessity of some of these things and kind of just like, well, at what point are we punishing people, for doing a job that very few other people will replace once we can them. So that's kind of the larger overarching issue here that I think is really interesting to look at.
I have echoes of James Madison's, if men were angels, no government would be necessary quotes running through my head right now. And I can't believe I didn't say DCF when I was doing my list before, because I mean, that's the perfect example that we've written about dozens of times now, right? And unfortunately, it goes back to that same question. When you create this, regulatory framework and you lock it up, then you unfortunately have those people then in government jobs who are protected doing, as we saw with the Harwinton stuff and many others. I mean, just some horrendous stories that I guess we don't need to get into now, but I feel like they're worth acknowledging. And I'm glad that you brought up the DCF problems. Um, I will say, from a journalistic perspective, we try to have compassion. We try to handle this in a way that is human and acknowledges kind of what's going on. And I think one of the things that we should briefly touch on is the fact that this family wasn't super thrilled that we were writing about this story. Uh,
No, no,
and
they were not.
which makes sense, right? Difficult part in time in your life. Of course, you don't want someone poking and prodding and bring it back into the light. But I want to compliment you on the way that you handled that first, which is that, my understanding and the communication has been that, you went out of your way to have human conversations and try to understand what their concerns were. We went ahead and used pseudonyms so they're not directly, identifiable. We want to do the right things for people and provide that anonymity where we can. Obviously, that's not always the case or not always possible. But I think, if we hold ourselves to a higher standard, I think that's something all journalists should do. I see it as part of the ethical baseline, frankly. Like I don't even feel like that's reaching. Like let's just be good people when we go out to do our jobs. Um, do you ever feel handicapped as a journalist because of that, or?
Oh, I think anybody who's done journalism has felt handicapped at numerous points, you know. But it's part of the job, and there's every case is different, right? You know, sometimes you get people who want to be anonymous, and you're just scratching your head like, what are we talking about here? And then other times, you know, whether it's from a professional standpoint, it's like, look, if I were you, I wouldn't want to lose my job either. Totally get that. Totally respect that. And what's the hardest, I guess, for me is ones like this where it is for personal reasons. Like I knew calling the family up before I was doing that. I was just like, man, as I was dialing the numbers, I'm like, this is going to be an awkward conversation, you know. But again, that is part of the job, right? I mean, it's just kind of it's a muscle that you have to strengthen. It certainly does get easier over time as you kind of navigate and talk to all different sorts of people for all different sorts of stories. You kind of just find your way around it. But I think it's exactly as you say, as long as you kind of just present yourself as a human. I know that, you know, when we're writing, there's like there's the journalistic style, right? It's not necessarily academic, it's not necessarily like a research paper, but the way that we write is not how you would text your friend in the group chat. It is very formal. There you can take some artistic liberty, but at the end of the day, like it's very structured. But that is not, I don't think that's the right way to go about actually interacting with people to form the story. You know, I'm not approaching them as a sociologist or as a, well, I guess sometimes as a psychiatrist. I joke sometimes that, you know, being a journalist and working personal stories, it is
What
kind
you
of
get
like,
for being so friendly, though, right? I mean, you're a relatable
yeah.
guy. That's what happens.
Yeah, exactly. You just have to approach people as a human first and foremost and understand that they are as well. If you can't do that, I don't think you should be working in this job. And things kind of work themselves out from there, you know.
For
So,
sure. I want to talk about moving forward. Obviously, this is not the end of this topic for you. But before we get there, I just wanted to mention really briefly on the point of anonymity. It's really important that people realize that being anonymous doesn't mean that you're anonymous to the reporter. It means that we provide a pseudonym or, you're providing information on background. There's a lot of different ways to handle it in a technical fashion. But a reporter is always going to need to know who you are to verify facts, to understand, for follow-up questions. I mean, there's a laundry list of reasons why you want to know who your sources are. But that is a common misconception that we get pretty frequently with tipsters is, hey, I'm anonymous, I'm reaching out, I have all this very specific information. Good luck finding it. You are unable to get it. So, we need partnerships in tipsters, and we offer significant whistleblower protections. Frankly, if someone wants to know who you are and we've promised you anonymity, we're going to tell them to go pound sand and protect your identity. That's our promise, because if we're going to root out corruption, we recognize you might be in a situation where you're kind of stuck. By providing something to us, you put yourself at risk, and we will do everything we can to protect you on that front. Um, let's talk about that moving forward thing, though. We put a bit at the end of the investigation saying if you've had troubles, reach out to Brandon. You have your email address there. What are you looking for, or what kind of information are you hoping to get out of that?
so really it's just you know, this thing has kind of snowballed beyond just John, beyond Jared originally. There's a lot of complaints that I've heard about this particular program that are just shared by numerous people. Those complaints are obviously inefficient funding. Well, not inefficient. Well, yeah, inefficient as well. Insufficient and
Yeah.
inefficient because you don't get enough money, and a lot of people have not been getting paid on time in a timely fashion. Um, people who have been cut off from their money in ways that they feel are undeserving, especially the residential funding. Just inadequate support as far as, hey, I cannot provide care 24/7. If I'm away at work or if a day program for somebody gets canceled because the wards in CCH are supposed to be at a 6 hour a day program. If that gets canceled, who's helping me there? So those are all very common complaints, but also just the feelings of retaliatory investigations. So people who have had these arguments over those issues with their superiors, and then next thing they know, boom, there's an investigation from an undisclosed source being opened up into them by DDS for neglect, financial abuse, so on and so forth. And so a lot of these providers have been telling me, look, we feel that this was done in retaliation. So that's really the big one there. All those other complaints typically lead to that one big one. And that's why I FOIA'd for the investigation files of various providers and was kind of just bummed out when, it's illegal to get them, essentially. But anybody who
Welcome
can,
DDS whistleblowers as well. Talk to us about what's going on behind the closed door. That would also be another way to go about doing this.
yeah, people who formerly worked there. If you used to work there and you don't anymore, feel free.
Absolutely. Yeah, come talk to us. As you can tell, Brandon is a very talented reporter who has a penchant for finding these stories and telling them in a really, really impressive way. I'm going to put a bow on this as we're running out of time here. Just a big thank you to all of you who read, who share, who comment, who send us feedback, who donate to make this all possible. Truly, truly appreciate it. We are lucky to wake up every morning and have this as our career and the pursuit of rooting out corruption. It's a passionate team full of people who genuinely give a damn about what's going on and are fully devoted to this mission. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Inside Update. Until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.